Welcome to today's deep dive. We're absolutely thrilled to have you joining us.
Truly thrilled.
For you, the curious learner who is constantly looking to unpack the fascinating complexities of the world, you are in for something truly spectacular today. We are exploring a plant that defies almost every expectation you might have about botany, agriculture, and, well, even the culinary arts.
It really does hit all those marks.
It's simultaneously this incredibly rugged desert survivor, a high-end culinary delicacy, the center of a historical scandal that rocked the agricultural world, and a bioengineering mystery that we are still learning from today. We are, of course, talking about the prickly pear cactus.
Scientifically known as the Opuntia genus.
Right, the Opuntia. And our mission today is to decode this plant from root to tip. We're looking at a massive cross-section of data today, everything from early 1900s agricultural boom records and botanical databases to step-by-step culinary methodologies from top chefs.
And we even have some hands-on ranching memoirs from the American Southwest in the mix.
Exactly. We'll explore exactly how you can cultivate this fortress of a plant in your own landscape, how you can safely dismantle its armor to eat it without, ending up in the emergency room.
Which is a real possibility.
Oh, absolutely. And we will dive deep into the shocking early 20th century cactus bubble that almost ruined the reputation of a legendary botanist. Okay, let's unpack this.
It really is a marvel of adaptation and human ambition. Humans have spent over a century trying to tame this prickly survivor, attempting to bend it to our will, to strip it of its evolutionary defenses and turn it into the perfect, compliant agricultural crop. But as we are going to see, nature always has the last word. When you look at the botanical data, the historical archives, and the culinary traditions surrounding this plant, a very clear theme emerges. You cannot simply force the Opuntia into a traditional box.
You really can't. And to understand why, before you ever try to handle one of these plants in the wild or even just at a garden center, we have to start with its biology and its anatomy.
Right, because nothing about the Opuntia operates like a standard herbaceous perennial.
Nothing at all. It is a genus in the cactus family, and its structure is brilliantly evolved for survival in some of the harshest, most arid climates on the planet.
Which means it had to get creative. When you look at a prickly pear, the most recognizable feature is what appears to be its leaves. But those fleshy green, flat, oval-shaped parts aren't actually leaves at all.
Right, and this is where Botany 101 gets completely turned on its head, because those green pads are modified stems.
Exactly. Properly, in botanical terms, they're called thalli, or a single thallus. They have taken over the entire role of photosynthesis because the plant dropped its traditional leaves thousands of years ago.
Just got rid of them entirely.
Yep, to prevent water loss through transpiration. In culinary context, though, especially in Mexican, Central American, and Southwestern cuisine, you will hear these thallis referred to as nopales.
Or nopalitos, right, when they're young.
Right, nopalitos when they are harvested young and tender.
And those thallis are really just the foundation of the whole thing. During the heat of the summer, those pads erupt with these gorgeous, vibrant flowers, which eventually produce the fruit of the cactus.
The fruit's known as tunas.
Yes, tunas, or sometimes referred to in older texts as spiny figs. Though, and we should clarify this, it's worth noting they have absolutely no biological relation to the figs you'd find in the Middle East.
Completely different family tree.
Totally different. But we can't talk about the anatomy of the Opuntia without talking about its armor. And this is where the plant demands absolute respect.
Oh, without a doubt.
There are two very distinct types of weaponry this plant deploys. First, you have the large, obvious spines that look like wooden toothpicks protruding from the pads. You see those, and your brain immediately registers danger.
It's a very clear stay-away signal.
But then there is the secondary defense system, the Glochids.
The Glochids are, frankly, the true menace of the prickly pear.
The absolute worst.
While the large spines are intimidating, they are static, easy to see, and relatively easy to avoid. Glochids, on the other hand, are insidious. They are microscopic, hair-like barbs that grow in dense clusters inside the areoles.
With the areoles being the little bumps all over the pads and the fruit.
Exactly. And because they are barbed on a microscopic level, they act almost like porcupine quills. If you even lightly brush against them, they detach from the plant instantly and lodge themselves deep into your skin.
Wait, so you don't even have to press hard. They just release on contact.
Merely a whisper of friction is enough. They are structurally designed to break away. And because they are so incredibly fine, they can easily pierce through standard woven gardening gloves, denim, and certainly human skin.
Which makes them a nightmare to get out.
A total nightmare. They are notoriously difficult to remove because the moment you try to pull them out with tweezers, the fragile hair breaks off below the surface of the skin, leaving the barb embedded. Yeah, they will eventually work themselves out of your skin through natural cell shedding, but it is an incredibly irritating burning sensation that can last for days.
Which brings us to a massive point of confusion in the botanical and commercial world. Because of these glochids and the massive toothpick spines, humans have naturally sought out so-called spineless varieties for their home gardens.
Obviously. Nobody wants to brush past a microscopic minefield on their way to the mailbox.
What's fascinating here is how the term spineless is thrown around as a marketing buzzword, often leading to a lot of disappointment and sometimes physical pain for the home gardener.
When you dig into the botanical classifications, there are a few specific species you absolutely have to differentiate.
Let's break those down.
First, there is Opuntia ficus indica, specifically the Indian fig variety. This is the plant that the famous botanist Luther Burbank heavily experimented with, crossing it with Opuntia tuna, the Mexican prickly pear.
And we are definitely going to get into this specific, highly controversial story of Burbank's agricultural bubble later.
Oh, we have to. But his ultimate goal was a bioengineered spineless wonder plant. However, the plant that is often mistakenly sold at generic garden centers as Burbank's creation today is actually something entirely different.
And this is where a major historical correction comes in. The master growers at specialty nurseries point out that the plant many commercial centers used to offer as Burbank spineless is actually a completely different naturally occurring species.
It's called Opuntia ellisiana.
Right. And for you, as a potential grower or landscape designer listening, this is actually fantastic news. The ellisiana is the true, cold, hardy, spineless, prickly pear.
The distinction is critical. Burbank's ficus indica hybrids were notoriously fragile. They were pampered lab creations that could not handle cold weather or drought particularly well.
They needed a lot of babying.
Too much babying. But the Opuntia ellisiana is a robust, resilient plant native to the challenging environments of the U.S. and Mexico. If you were to plant this in your yard, it forms a stunning architectural, deer-resistant mound.
And it grows pretty fast, right?
Yeah, in about 5 years, you get a sculptural plant, roughly 3 feet tall and spreading 6 feet wide, completely made up of these smooth, 6-inch gray-green thalli.
And the visual payoff in the summer is incredible. It's not just a gray-green blob. In midsummer, the ellisiana erupts into what botanists often describe as a bumblebee oasis.
I love that term.
It's so accurate. It produces these massive, saucer-shaped, bright yellow flowers all along the upper rims of the pads. It's an absolute magnet for native pollinators. And after the flowers fade, you get a heavy crop of those large, reddish-purple tunas.
So you have this striking sculptural base, a burst of bright yellow, and then deep magenta fruit.
It's an incredibly dynamic, living piece of architecture for a dry landscape.
But we must add a crucial caveat to the word spineless.
Yes, very important.
Even the ellisiana, while entirely lacking those large, terrifying toothpick spines, is never truly 100% safe to handle with bare hands.
Never trust it completely.
Exactly. You must always assume there might be a stray glochid hiding in an aerial. The evolutionary programming of the plant is just too strong to ever fully erase its defenses.
It's in its DNA.
However, compared to the wild desert varieties, it is vastly more manageable for a home garden, especially if you live in USDA hardiness zones 7A to 10B.
In those zones, it can easily handle winter temperatures dropping all the way down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit.
Provided you give it the right environmental conditions, of course.
Which means we need to talk about the actual logistics of getting one of these into the ground. Because if you treat an Opuntia like a normal garden center purchase, you're going to kill it.
Very quickly.
Cultivating a succulent, especially a large cactus, is a completely different ballgame compared to planting a tomato, an oak tree, or a rose bush. The rules of traditional gardening are basically thrown out the window.
They really are. When you order an Opuntia online or buy one from a specialized cactus nursery, it generally does not arrive in a plastic pot full of rich soil with a heavily developed root system.
No, it's way more basic than that.
It arrives as an unrooted pad, just a single, severed green paddle lying in a cardboard box. To the uninitiated, it looks like a piece of yard waste that has fallen off a tree and is waiting to decompose.
It looks dead.
It does. But in the world of succulents, this severed pad is a fully self-contained starter kit, packed with enough moisture and cellular energy to grow an entirely new root system.
But before you even open that box, you need the right gear. Do not just reach in with your bare hands, and don't trust standard cotton gardening gloves. You must use tongs.
Essential equipment.
Long, heavy-duty stainless steel kitchen or barbecue tongs are your best friend here, combined with thick, heavy-duty leatherwork gloves for an extra layer of safety. You are handling a plant that, even if it's the spineless ellisiana variety, demands physical respect.
Once you have your unrooted pad safely gripped in your tongs, you need to select the right microclimate in your yard. Opuntia demands at least 6 hours of full, direct, blazing sunlight every single day.
No shade.
It does not tolerate shade. But even more critical than the sun is the soil chemistry and structure. It must be gritty, aerated, and extremely well-draining.
Because the enemy of the prickly pear is not scorching heat, and it's certainly not drought.
No, it is standing water. If the roots sit in damp, heavy clay-like soil, they will suffocate and rot, and the plant will literally collapse from the base up into a pile of mush.
So how do you prep the soil?
You can use a pre-formulated commercial succulent soil, or you can mix your own using 1 part standard potting soil to 1 part coarse, sharp builder's sand.
I've read some professional growers even go as far as lining the planting hole with a thick layer of gravel to guarantee that water drains away from the base instantly.
Wait, hold on. This is where the planting process gets truly counterintuitive.
Okay.
If I'm planting a regular herbaceous perennial, I dig a hole, put the roots in, backfill it with rich dirt, pack it down to remove air pockets, and immediately soak it with a hose, right?
Right. That's what we've all been taught.
Doesn't that go against literally every rule of Botany 101 when it comes to cactus?
It sounds crazy, but you have to remember, we aren't dealing with a typical fibrous root system here. Doing a traditional planting method to an Opuntia pad is a near-guaranteed death sentence.
So what's the right way?
The master growers dictate a very precise, almost hands-off method. You dig a shallow trench, only about 2 to 3 inches wide and deep, just enough to fit the bottom third of the pad. Then, using your tongs, you lean the pad into the shallow hole, and here is the shocker.
What?
You do not refill the hole right away. You leave it open.
You just lean a severed piece of a plant against the side of a dirt divot and walk away. It feels so wrong. Why do we do that? What is happening at the cellular level?
Because the pad doesn't have roots yet. It needs to organically sprout them from the areoles, those little Glochid-producing bumps on the skin that are now positioned just below the soil line. For those adventitious roots to sprout effectively, they need atmospheric oxygen.
Ah, so they need to breathe.
Exactly. They thrive best when surrounded by warm air and loose grit, not smothered in dense, wet dirt. So you lean it, you stabilize it with maybe a rock or two, and you leave it alone.
Okay, but what about watering? The universal human instinct is to water a newly planted addition to the garden to settle it in.
You must resist that instinct entirely. You must wait a minimum of 3 to 5 days before applying a single drop of water to that soil.
3 to 5 days.
Yes. The pad has a physical wound at the base where it was cut or broken from the mother plant. That open wound needs time to callus over. In botanical terms, it needs to form a layer of suberin, a waxy substance that acts like a scab. It needs to heal in the dry, warm air.
Makes sense. If you introduce water to an open, uncalloused wound on a succulent, soil-borne bacteria and fungi will immediately invade the vascular tissue.
And that causes a fatal rot that will turn your promising green pad into a slimy, foul-smelling black mess in a matter of days. Once you've waited those few days for the callus to form, you can begin a very conservative watering schedule to coax the roots out.
And that schedule changes drastically with the seasons, right? Because it's not a houseplant you water every Tuesday.
Not at all. In the height of summer, when it's actively growing and expending massive amounts of energy to produce those yellow flowers, you might water it weekly, but only, and this is massive, only when the soil is completely 100% bone dry to the touch, several inches down.
By early fall, as the days shorten, you drop that to bi-weekly.
And in the winter, when the plant naturally goes dormant to survive the freezing temperatures, you essentially stop watering it entirely. You just let it sleep.
You only give it a tiny sip if the pads look dangerously shriveled or folded in on themselves. It is truly a plant that thrives on neglect.
But while it thrives on neglect regarding water, it can benefit immensely from the right kind of organic nutrition. While you don't have to fertilize an established Opuntia, they pull what they need from poor soils quite well if you want maximum pad growth, Or if you want to ensure a spectacular heavy bloom of those yellow flowers, there is a specific, complex organic fertilizer formulation that works best.
I love looking at this specific organic recipe because it's fascinating to see what a desert plant actually consumes to build that fortress.
It is. The recipe starts with 4 parts of either seed meal or fish meal. Why start with such a heavy organic base?
Well, seed meal, which is an agricultural byproduct of oil making, like cottonseed meal or soy meal or fish meal, provides the heavy lifting for nitrogen. Nitrogen is the fundamental building block for green vegetative growth.
So that's what gives you the big pads.
Right, it's what's going to encourage the plant to produce more of those thick, fleshy nopales.
Mm.
Fish meal has a very strong lingering odor, so cottonseed meal is often preferred for home gardens, but both are excellent slow-release nitrogen sources that feed the soil microbiome.
But you have to be careful with it, right?
Incredibly careful not to overdo the nitrogen, especially on young plants, or you'll trigger rapid, weak, spindly growth that can't support the weight of the plant, and it will snap in the wind.
To balance that heavy nitrogen, the recipe calls for 1 part agricultural lime, specifically dolomite lime.
Yes, the dolomite lime acts relatively quickly to adjust the soil pH, preventing it from becoming too acidic from the seed meal. But more importantly, it provides a heavy dose of calcium and magnesium.
Calcium is vital.
It literally strengthens the cell walls of the plant, making that tough outer skin even more resilient against environmental stress, freezing temperatures, and piercing insects.
And then comes the powerhouse mix designed specifically for the blooms. 1 part of a mixture containing 1/3 rock phosphate, 1/3 bone meal, and 1/3 kelp meal.
This is the critical component for reproductive energy, the fruit and flower production.
Yeah.
Both bone meal and rock phosphate are massive, dense sources of phosphorus.
And phosphorus is the trigger.
Exactly. It's the chemical trigger that signals the plant to transition from just growing vegetative green pads to pushing out those stunning bright yellow flowers, which, of course, eventually swell into the magenta tunas. Bone meal acts a bit faster, breaking down in a few weeks, while rock phosphate is a slow-release mineral that breaks down over months or even years.
And the kelp meal.
The kelp meal provides potassium for deep root development and a vital suite of micronutrients and trace elements that act like a daily multivitamin for the cactus. You gently scratch this complex dry mix into the top layer of the grit around the base of the plant, and it provides a slow, steady, organic feed that won't chemically burn the sensitive new roots.
It's just incredible. You build this perfect, gritty, dry environment. You feed it this precise, slow-release organic mix, and you have this architectural fortress of a plant that can survive 20-degree winters and 110-degree scorching summers without flinching.
It is a fortress. But this raises an important question. What happens when the fortress is breached?
Yeah, what then?
Because despite its rugged exterior, its thorns, its glochids, its thick, waxy skin, and its tolerance for extreme weather, the Opuntia is actually a primary target for a surprisingly wide array of incredibly destructive pests and plagues. When the desert survivor gets sick, the decline is breathtakingly fast.
The pathology records are genuinely alarming. Let's look at the physiological and fungal threats before we get to the insects. One of the most common issues growers face is scab.
Scab is interesting.
Right, because this isn't a fungus or a virus, it's a physiological response. If you overwater the cactus, or if it's planted in a spot with heavy humidity and poor air circulation, it develops these rusty-colored, hard, corky areas all over the stems.
It's basically a severe form of plant edema.
The roots take up water faster than the plant can use it, the interior cells swell with excess moisture, and they literally burst under the pressure, leaving behind cork-like scar tissue on the skin.
And if you see a light brown, moist rot spreading rapidly across the green pads, punctuated by these distinct light pink pustules on the surface, you are looking at cactus anthracnose, caused by the Colaptotoxicum fungus.
Those pink pustules sound terrible.
They are literally microscopic spore-producing factories. Once this fungus takes hold in the vascular tissue, there is no chemical spray or systemic cure. None. The only solution is aggressive, immediate surgery. You have to take a sterilized knife, physically cut away the diseased thalli entirely, dipping the knife in alcohol between every single cut, and then destroy the infected tissue before the spores go airborne and wipe out the entire plant.
Then there's scorch, or sun scald, caused by the fungus Hendersonia opuntiae. The pads develop these distinctly zoned, yellowish-brown spots that enlarge and merge until the entire pad turns a cracked grayish-brown, looking like old leather, and dies.
But the absolute most terrifying disease in the botanical records is stem rot, caused by the fungus Drosera cactivorum.
It sounds like a horror movie.
It acts like one. It usually starts stealthily at the soil line or on delicate seedlings, presenting as little, innocuous yellow spots. But the mycelial network of this fungus is incredibly aggressive. Within 4 days, just 96 hours, it can completely digest and rot the cactus from the inside out.
96 hours to destroy a plant.
Yes, turning a robust 50-pound green plant into a shriveled, mummified husk covered in dark brown spores.
It highlights just how delicate the internal balance of a succulent really is. The thick, waxy skin does a brilliant job of keeping life-saving moisture in, but if a pathogenic fungus breaches that skin through a wound or a bug bite, the moist, fleshy, nutrient-rich interior becomes the absolute perfect breeding ground for rapid, unstoppable rot.
But microscopic fungi aren't the only enemies breaching the walls. The Opuntia is heavily preyed upon by specialized insects.
Spiders and bugs.
Spider mites will attack it during hot, dry spells, causing a top-down rusty discoloration as they drain the surface cells. Aphids will cluster around and suck the sweet juices out of the tender new flower buds. Various scale insects will attach themselves to the shaded undersides of the pads, forming hard, powdery protective barriers over their bodies while they permanently attach and siphon off the plant's sap.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because there is one specific pest that attacks the prickly pear that is so biologically unique and so massively historically significant that it almost ceases to be considered a pest and becomes a completely separate, highly lucrative agricultural commodity. I am, of course, talking about the cochineal bug.
The cochineal is one of the most fascinating insect-plant relationships in the world. If you are inspecting your Opuntia in the garden and you see these bright white, sticky, cotton-like mounds covering the green pads mounds that look exactly like patches of fuzzy white fungus or mold, you do not have a fungal disease.
You have a bug problem.
You have a cochineal infestation. Those white fuzzy patches are actually complex, waxy, protective housings built by the female insects. They spin this cotton-like substance to protect their soft bodies and their nymphs from the harsh sun and from predators, while they permanently attach their mouthparts to the cactus and continuously drain its juices.
And here is the slightly grotesque but completely foolproof test you can do in your own garden to confirm it. If you aren't sure if that white patch is a dangerous fungus or a cochineal bug, the experts say to just take your finger, wearing a glove, obviously, to avoid the Glochids, and firmly squish one of those white fuzzy mounds against the pad.
If it's a fungus, it just smushes into a gray paste.
But if it's the cochineal bug, squishing it will instantly yield this incredibly bright, vibrant, almost fluorescent red or deep magenta liquid. It looks exactly like the cactus's bleeding bright red blood.
That brilliant red liquid is carminic acid. The cochineal insect synthesizes this acid from the cactus sap specifically as a chemical defense mechanism to deter predators, mainly ants.
But humans discovered centuries ago that this specific acid is one of the most stable, light, fast, and vibrant natural dyes in the natural world.
Long before the invention of synthetic chemical dyes in the 1850s, the cochineal insect was deliberately farmed and harvested from prickly pears by indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica, specifically the Aztec and Maya, to produce brilliant crimson, scarlet, and purple colors for their textiles and murals.
And the historical weight of this bug is staggering. When the Spanish arrived and saw this color, a red far brighter and more permanent than anything available in Europe at the time, they immediately monopolized it. Cochineal dye became a massive global export.
In fact, for a significant period during the colonial era, dried cochineal bugs were the second most valuable export out of the New World, second only to silver.
Second only to silver. That's unbelievable. Kings, cardinals, and the British redcoats all wore garments dyed with the crushed bodies of bugs that fed on the prickly pear cactus.
Even today, if you look closely at the ingredient lists of certain high-end cosmetics, luxury lipsticks, natural food colorings, or pharmaceuticals, you might see Carmine, cochineal extract, or natural red 4 listed. It remains a highly prized, completely natural commodity.
But, assuming you aren't trying to resurrect a 16th century textile dyeing business in your backyard and you just want your landscape cactus to survive the summer, how do you actually get rid of them? Because they will eventually drain a plant to death.
The agricultural extension advice provides some very practical, non-chemical methods. First, rely on mechanical force. Get a high-power, concentrated nozzle on your garden hose and just physically blast the sticky white mounds right off the pads. The bugs underneath that fuzz are soft-bodied, so the sheer water pressure and the impact against the ground is often enough to destroy them.
If the infestation has progressed beyond what a simple blast from a hose can handle, you have to escalate your tactics. The next step is physical scrubbing. You mix insecticidal soap or even just plain, unscented liquid dish soap with water.
For small, localized areas, a stiff toothbrush works perfectly, but for a large, mature cactus, you'll need a long-handled scrub brush.
You physically scrub the waxy housings and the insects off the skin of the plant. The soap breaks down their protective wax and suffocates them. It's incredibly labor-intensive, and you have to be meticulously careful navigating around the spines, but it is the absolute most effective, non-toxic way to save the plant without resorting to harsh systemic pesticides.
It's just wild to conceptualize. This plant is a literal biological fortress covered in microscopic irritating barbs and giant piercing spikes, capable of surviving freezing winters and baking deserts, yet it is constantly under siege by fungi that can mummify it in under a week, and tiny insects that use it as a personal juice box to synthesize priceless crimson dye.
And observing this incredible, rugged, embattled plant in the late 19th and early 20th century was Luther Burbank. And he looked at this heavily defended fortress and decided he was going to tear the walls down.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Luther Burbank's obsession with the prickly pear is one of the most fascinating, bizarre, and ultimately tragic chapters in American agricultural history.
Burbank wasn't just some backyard tinkerer. He was a legendary horticulturist, world famous for creating the Burbank potato, which helped combat the blight in Ireland, and hundreds of other commercially successful varieties of fruits, flowers, and vegetables.
Between 1907 and 1925, he turned his massive intellect toward the Opuntia, introducing over 60 varieties of what he aggressively marketed as perfectly spineless cacti.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the early 1900s, this was an era defined by a belief that human ingenuity could conquer and improve nature. Burbank's stated goal for the cactus was nothing short of a utopian moonshot.
He wanted to take the Opuntia ficus indica and the Mexican Opuntia tuna, crossbreed them over multiple generations, completely breed out the large spines and the microscopic Glochids, and turn the seemingly worthless, arid, unforgiving deserts of the world into lush, incredibly productive agricultural pastures.
He wasn't just trying to make a smooth novelty plant for a garden. He genuinely believed he was solving global hunger by creating the ultimate drought-resistant cattle fodder.
The marketing hype surrounding this project was absolutely unprecedented. In his own authorized writings, he leaned into the drama, calling the selective breeding process soul testing and an absolute ordeal.
Claiming he spent 5 years in sheer physical torment, pulling thousands of cactus spines out of his hands and face to find the perfect genetic mutations.
But by 1907, he declared total, monumental victory. He published a glossy commercial catalog that read more like science fiction than botany. He claimed his new spineless hybrids could yield an astonishing 200 tons of food per acre.
200 tons?
Yes. He stated publicly that this new agricultural era was an achievement on par with the discovery of a new continent. And the financial world, swept up in the Gilded Age optimism, bought it hook, line, and sinker.
He made a staggering $27,000, a massive life-changing fortune at the time, selling the exclusive rights to just a few of these hybrid varieties to a single Southern California distribution company.
Now, we have to look at this impartially and contrast the commercial hype with what the historical archives and the scientific community were actually saying at the time. Because while wealthy investors were throwing massive sums of money at Burbank, the botanists at the U.S. Department of Agriculture were looking at the actual cellular reality of his creations.
In late 1907, right as the hype was peaking, a government horticulturist named Dr. David Griffiths released an exhaustive, highly detailed 67-page pamphlet titled The Tuna as Food for Man.
And without ever mentioning Luther Burbank by name, Griffiths systematically, scientifically dismantled the entire utopian dream of the spineless cactus as a miracle crop.
Let's dive into Griffiths' arguments, because they are a masterclass in understanding how evolutionary trade-offs work. Griffiths pointed out the fundamental biological reality that bioengineering this plant to be spineless inherently makes it weak.
The spines on a wild cactus aren't just offensive weapons against hungry animals, they serve critical environmental functions.
They provide microshade against the blistering sun. They break up dry, sweeping winds that would otherwise suck moisture from the skin.
And crucially, a dense network of spines traps a boundary layer of still air right against the skin of the plant, which acts as a thermal blanket, protecting the fleshy thalli from sudden freezing desert temperatures.
By selectively stripping the cactus of its spines and glochids, Burbank had inadvertently created a plant that was environmentally naked and incredibly fragile.
Griffiths noted in his pamphlet that these new, smooth varieties absolutely lacked the necessary cold hardiness. If the temperature dropped below 20 degrees, the cells ruptured, and the miracle crop died overnight.
Furthermore, Griffiths attacked the core of Burbank's utopian promise, the yield. To achieve that miraculous, world-saving 200 tons per acre yield that Burbank promised, the cactus couldn't just be thrown into dry desert sand and abandoned.
It required heavy, constant irrigation and nutrient-rich soil, essentially requiring the exact same amount of water and fertilizer it takes to grow a traditional field of alfalfa.
So, to summarize the botanical reality, Burbank's creation couldn't survive the cold desert nights because it had no thermal protection, and it needed just as much precious water as traditional crops to grow fast enough to be economically viable. It was a complete structural failure as a world-changing, low-input cattle fodder.
But the controversy surrounding Burbank goes much deeper than just overzealous marketing and ignoring biological trade-offs. The historical archives detail two major accusations leveled against Burbank and his distribution company regarding deliberate deception.
The first major accusation involves a highly curated display garden Burbank maintained at his Santa Rosa experimental farm. According to field reports from a prominent botanist from the Carnegie Institution who traveled to study Burbank's highly publicized methods, Burbank had deliberately planted a large 15-foot square bed of sprawling, incredibly thorny, visually aggressive wild desert cacti.
And right in the exact center of this forbidding spiky patch, he planted a single, perfectly smooth, incredibly fat slab specimen of his pampered, heavily irrigated spineless hybrid.
Visitors and potential investors would come in droves, look at the dramatic visual contrast, and marvel at the wizardry that seemingly transformed the dangerous weeds into the smooth wonder plant overnight.
The Carnegie botanist felt this staging was highly deceptive to an uncritical public, implying a miraculous magical transformation rather than a long, slow, selective breeding process utilizing already partially spineless natural varieties.
And then came the absolute scandal of 1915, the moment the Burbank cactus bubble finally and spectacularly burst. The Luther Burbank Company, which independently handled his mass commercial sales, received a massive, highly lucrative order for thousands of spineless cacti from agricultural investors in Mexico.
An order so astronomically large they couldn't actually fulfill it with their available stock of true hybrids.
So allegedly, to secure the massive payout, they simply sourced regular, naturally thorny, prickly pear cacti from the wild, hired workers to physically shave the thorns off them with knives until the pads were smooth, and shipped them south across the border.
It was an audacious, desperate fraud. And of course, the underlying biology of the plant made it impossible to hide. The moment those physically shaved plants were put into the ground in Mexico, established their roots, and began to push out new vegetative growth, they immediately sprouted their natural, heavy, genetically programmed thorns.
The deceit was instantly, undeniably exposed. Every single thorny plant had shipped with a physical tag guaranteeing it was an original Burbank spineless production.
It was a massive scandal that led to lawsuits and severely tarnished Burbank's legacy in his later years. It stands as a profound historical illustration of the dangers of prioritizing agricultural miracles and commercial hype over strict botanical realities.
He tried to force the plant to be perfect for human industrial needs, and in doing so, stripped it of its fundamental ability to survive on its own terms.
But here is the incredible, enduring irony of the whole Burbank saga. While his grand industrial dream of creating a spineless cattle fodder to conquer the world's deserts completely failed, the plant itself, the regular, heavily defended, wild, prickly Opuntia, remained a massive success for direct human consumption.
People didn't need Burbank to invent a new, weak plant. Indigenous peoples and locals in arid regions had been successfully, safely eating the wild, heavily armored varieties for centuries by simply adapting their culinary techniques to work around the plant's defenses.
Which brings us directly from the historical archives into the field. How do you actually harvest a wild plant that is actively biologically evolved to cause you intense physical pain?
We have this fantastic, highly detailed first-hand account from a travel and food writer known as Unstoppable Stacy, who traveled to the Tonk Verde Ranch in Tucson, Arizona, specifically to learn the traditional art of foraging the prickly pear fruit, the tunas, at the peak of late summer.
The reality of desert foraging requires serious respect and meticulous preparation. You aren't strolling through an air-conditioned grocery store. You are walking out into the Sonoran Desert in late August.
It is over 100 degrees, the air is bone dry, the terrain is rugged, and absolutely everything around you is evolved to be sharp, venomous, or tough.
The gear list Stacy details is non-negotiable. She talks about wearing sturdy, thick leather boots. She specifically mentions relying on heavy fry boots. And you aren't just wearing those for ankle support on the uneven, rocky terrain. You are wearing thick leather because you are sharing that physical space with diamondback rattlesnakes and low-growing, needle-sharp scrub brush.
You need long, heavy denim sleeves and thick denim pants to protect against the inevitable stray spines as you push through the brush. You need a wide-brimmed, solid hat to survive the unrelenting sun. You need thick leather work gloves.
And crucially, for the harvest itself, you need galvanized steel utility pails to carry the fruit. Do not ever use a canvas tote bag, a burlap sack, or a woven basket, because the microscopic glochids on the fruit will instantly detach, embed themselves deeply into the fabric fibers, and ruin that bag forever. You need solid, impenetrable steel.
Once you are properly armored and out in the intense heat of the field, the cognitive analysis of the fruit begins. You can't just pick every tuna you see. You are looking for very precise, specific visual cues that indicate peak ripeness and maximum sugar content.
A perfectly ripe tuna will be a deep, dark, saturated magenta color all the way through. There can be absolutely no trace of green remaining near the base or on the skin. If it's even slightly green, it's not ready, the starches haven't converted to sugar, and it will taste fibrous and bitter.
The guides at the ranch point out that the most vibrant, swollen, ripe fruits are often found on the specific plants that happen to get a little more microirrigation, perhaps situated near ranch buildings, road runoff areas, or natural desert washes.
And almost universally, the ripest fruits grow on the absolute highest, uppermost, sun-baked petals of the plant.
And the physical mechanics of the harvest are like playing a very dangerous high-stakes game of operation. You do not ever touch the fruit directly with your hands. Even heavy leather gloves will eventually succumb to hundreds of microscopic Glochids working their way through the seams.
You use long, high-quality stainless steel kitchen tongs. You carefully reach across the thorny lower petals, grip the dark magenta fruit firmly with the tongs, and give it a slight, gentle twisting motion.
If the fruit is fully ripe, it will snap off the areole cleanly and easily with a satisfying pop. You transfer it directly from the grip of the tongs straight into the galvanized steel pail. You just meander through the baking desert, highly focused, twisting and dropping, twist and drop, until your heavy steel pails are brimming with magenta fruit.
But as any seasoned forager will tell you, surviving the heat and harvesting the fruit is actually the easy part. The true test of patience, technique, and culinary skill comes when you drag those heavy pails back out of the desert and into the kitchen.
The preparation of both the fruit and the vegetative pads is a grueling, meticulous, multi-stage process that commands absolute respect for the plant's residual defenses. So what does this all mean for your dinner plate? Let's break down exactly what this culinary magic entails, pulling heavily from the documented techniques of executive sous chef Janet Hugazian at the Tonk Verde Ranch and the legendary master of Mexican cuisine, Chef Rick Bayless.
We'll start with the fruit, the tunas. You bring your steel pail into the industrial kitchen. What is the very first step to disarming them?
Step 1 relies on bulk water pressure and abrasion. You carefully dump the raw pods into a massive colander in a deep sink. You use a high-pressure commercial sink sprayer to blast the fruit. This initial blast removes any desert dirt, flushes out insects like the cochineal we discussed earlier, and knocks off the loosest, most obvious of the large spines.
Then, while the high-pressure water is still running continuously over them, you grab the colander and repeatedly, aggressively swirl the heavy batch of fruit around.
The physical friction of the hard fruits knocking aggressively against each other and against the metal sides of the colander under the running water acts as an intense abrasive. It physically rubs off and washes away a large, significant portion of those dangerous microscopic glochid fibers down the drain.
But as Chef Janet rigorously notes, that abrasion technique doesn't get all of them. It's impossible to wash them all off. So to actually handle the fruit for cutting, you have to armor your hands a second time.
You put on standard, tight-fitting, disposable food service plastic gloves, and then you put heavy leather work gloves over the plastic. The thick leather stops any remaining big spines from piercing you, and the interior plastic layer ensures that none of the microscopic glochids can migrate through the leather seams and embed themselves into your bare skin.
With your heavily armored hands, you use tongs to place a single tuna on the cutting board. You take a very sharp, heavy chef's knife and confidently slice off both the top and bottom tips of the fruit. Then, you make a shallow, precise lengthwise incision down the tough, thick outer skin from end to end.
If the fruit is perfectly ripe, you can use the edge of the knife blade to catch the lip of that slit and peel the thick skin back in one continuous piece, rolling out the incredibly slippery, vibrantly colored interior flesh. It requires incredibly detailed, focused knife work because the inside flesh is very juicy, slick, and difficult to control.
Once you have a mountain of this skinned flesh, it all goes into a large, heavy-bottomed pot with a little bit of water, and it's set to a low, slow simmer. EF Janet describes the aroma that rises from the pot as it breaks down as smelling intensely like rich, dark, warm plums.
As the cellular structure of the flesh simmers and breaks down into a liquid, any remaining stray cactus spikes or glochids that you missed during the peeling process will actually float to the surface of the liquid, sticking to the sides of the metal pot where they can be carefully skimmed off with a fine strainer ladle.
After the raw flesh fully breaks down, the chef adds specific flavorings to complement the natural profile, usually a touch of honey, a whole cinnamon stick, maybe some cloves or star anise, and continues to simmer it down to concentrate the flavor.
But the resulting thick juice is full of hard, inedible seeds and thick pulp, so it must be meticulously filtered. It is repeatedly pressed through a fine metal sieve and finally poured slowly through multiple layers of cheesecloth.
This multi-stage, painstaking filtration is the absolute only way to guarantee a perfectly smooth, luxurious juice completely free of seeds, pulp, and dangerous stray needles.
And the sheer volume of raw material required to produce this liquid is staggering. To yield just 1/3 of a cup of this vibrant, plum-scented filtered juice, you have to process roughly 35 individual pods.
35 spiky, dangerous fruits harvested in the desert heat, peeled with armored hands, simmered, and double-strained just for a few precious ounces of liquid.
But that liquid is absolute culinary gold. At the Tonk Verde Ranch, they use it as the base to make their famous prickly pear margaritas. They make vibrant prickly pear mimosas for breakfast, complex whiskey sours for the evening. They pour the syrup over shaved ice for a dessert. They use it as a sweet glaze for bone-in pork chops, and they even reduce it down for hours into a thick base for a sweet, tangy, deeply complex BBQ sauce.
It has a mild, sweet, almost watermelon meets bubblegum fruity flavor that acts as a perfect canvas for other bold ingredients, and the color is an absolutely shocking, beautiful neon magenta.
But the sweet fruit is only half of the culinary story. The vegetative pads themselves, the nopales, are a massive staple vegetable in Mexican cuisine. But prepping them requires a completely different, highly specific technique.
If you buy them whole at a market or harvest your own young, tender pads from a home plant, you must master the physical cleaning process. Chef Rick Bayless provides what is essentially the definitive masterclass guide to disarming a nopal.
Always holding the thick base of the pad firmly with your trusty tongs, you lay the flat paddle flat on a heavy cutting board. The absolute first step is to take your sharpest knife and decisively trim off the entire outer quarter-inch rim of the paddle. The curved edges of the pad are where the thorns and glochids are the most densely packed and the hardest to scrape off safely, so you don't even try. You just eliminate the edge entirely and discard it.
Once the dangerous rim is gone, you have to deal with the broad, flat surfaces. Bayless emphasizes that you must stop and look closely at the pad. The thorns and areoles all generally point in one uniform direction, usually upwards toward the tip.
You take your knife, holding the steel blade strictly perpendicular to the flat pad, and you aggressively scrape the blade against the grain of the thorns. You are essentially shaving the skin of the cactus.
You scrape one side completely clean, carefully wiping the sticky, gathered thorns off the board with a paper towel so they don't accidentally reattach to the flesh, and then you flip the pad with your tongs and aggressively shave the other side until it is entirely smooth.
Once it's perfectly smooth, clean, and safe to touch, you slice it into thin half-inch strips or dice it into small cubes. And here, we have to address the massive elephant in the room when it comes to eating nopales.
The texture.
Yes, the baba. That is the universal Mexican-Spanish culinary term for the thick, mucilaginous, gummy substance that the interior cells of the cactus pads exude the moment they are cut and exposed to heat. From a botanical standpoint, this mucilage is how the plant retains its water during severe droughts. But from a culinary standpoint, it has the exact same slippery, slimy texture as heavily cut okra. For many people unaccustomed to the cuisine, this highly viscous texture is intensely off-putting.
The common, somewhat amateur advice is to boil the diced nopales heavily in a huge pot of water to try and forcefully wash the slime away. But Chef Bayless argues forcefully that boiling ruins the flavor, and there is a much better, highly traditional cooking method.
He calls it cooking al vapor, which literally translates to steaming, but you aren't using water or a steamer basket. You put the raw, diced nopales directly into a wide, shallow pan over medium-high heat with a good dose of fat, either olive oil, vegetable oil, or traditionally pork lard, a heavy sprinkle of salt, and a thick slice of pungent raw onion. You absolutely do not add a single drop of water to the pan.
You immediately cover the hot pan with a tight-fitting lid and let the nopales cook in their own exuded juices for exactly 5 minutes. During this covered phase, the intense, trapped heat effectively draws all of that sticky mucilaginous baba completely out of the plant tissue.
When you pull the lid off after 5 minutes, the pan looks like a disaster. It is completely full of this thick, bubbling, gummy liquid, but you don't drain it and you don't panic. You simply leave the pan uncovered, keep the heat on medium-high, and let it cook for another 4 to 5 minutes.
And this is where the chemistry of cooking takes over. As it cooks uncovered, the water content in the baba rapidly boils off and evaporates. The mucilage literally cooks away entirely. When it's done, you are left with tender, slightly crunchy strips of nopal with a bright, lemony, tart flavor reminiscent of green beans crossed with asparagus and a squeeze of lime completely free of any slime, coated just slightly in the seasoned oil you started with, maybe even picking up a little bit of browning from the Maillard reaction at the very end.
And from there, the culinary applications are endless and deeply mouth-watering. You can let the cooked strips cool completely and toss them into a fresh, crunchy salad with tomatoes and a sharp splash of vinegar. You can chop them much finer and mix them into a vibrant, textural pico de gallo to serve with tortilla chips.
Or, as Chef Bayless notes, the ultimate, deeply traditional comfort food application. You take those perfectly cooked nopales and simmer them in a rich, complex Mexican stew alongside chunks of slow-cooked, tender pork shoulder, all swimming in a vibrant roasted green tomatillo sauce. The slight natural tartness and crunch of the nopales cuts through the heavy, fatty richness of the pork shoulder perfectly.
It is an absolute culinary triumph. You take a wild plant covered in microscopic, irritating weapons and thick defensive slime, and through sheer passed-down technique, chemical understanding, and patience, you turn it into a high-end delicacy. But the culinary uses of the Opuntia are really just the tip of the iceberg when we look at how humans have interacted with this plant.
As we move into our final section, we look back at Luther Burbank's catalog from circa 1914. While his utopian dream of a spineless cattle fodder completely failed, his extensive, documented list of alternative historical uses for the cactus reveals an incredible, almost desperate level of human ingenuity in harsh environments.
The historical utility of this plant is truly mind-boggling when you realize how every single part of it was optimized. It wasn't just a source of food, it was critical infrastructure, essential medicine, and complex chemistry for early settlers and indigenous populations.
Let's look at the physical structure of the older, mature plants. When an Opuntia grows large and survives for decades, the base pads undergo a process called lignification. They become incredibly woody, hard, and calcified to support the massive weight above.
Historically, in arid landscapes completely devoid of traditional timber trees, people would harvest these thick, woody cactus skeletons and use them as highly durable structural material to build rustic houses, construct fences, fashion sturdy furniture, and even carve intricate trinkets and hand fans.
And what about that baba? That exact same mucilaginous slime that modern chefs like Rick Bayless work so hard to evaporate out of their food. Historically, that specific chemical compound was a highly prized, essential binder.
Builders would take the raw juice of the thickest phthalae, boil it down over a fire until it became an incredibly dense, thick, sticky mucilage, and mix it directly into their construction materials. They would add it to wet adobe mortar to vastly increase its stickiness, flexibility, and holding power for laying bricks. They would mix it into lime wash and whitewash to vastly increase its durability against the harsh desert weather, making the paint bond tighter and longer to the exterior walls of their homes.
Its medicinal applications were just as vital, acting as a ubiquitous desert pharmacy. The thick, incredibly moist pads were essentially nature's bandages. If someone suffered an injury causing severe, painful joint inflammation or a localized infection, they would take a fresh, raw pad, carefully slice it open down the middle, and apply the cool, moist, gel-like interior directly to the skin as a natural poultice to rapidly draw out the heat and reduce swelling.
Furthermore, if you soaked the chopped pads in clean water, they released a viscous, nutrient-rich juice that was widely known and utilized to actively promote the accelerated healing of deep, open wounds and severe bruises. They even chemically processed the plant for light. The dense, waxy, resinous juice extracted from the oldest pads could actually be boiled and manufactured into slow-burning, durable candles.
And the traditional culinary preparations of the fruit went far, far beyond modern margaritas. Before the invention of refrigeration, preserving the massive, short-lived summer harvest was a matter of life and death.
They would take the ripe tunas and cook the fruit down over a low fire for hours and hours, constantly stirring until the water evaporated and it became a dense, incredibly dark red or black paste called malcocha, which was so high in sugar it could be stored indefinitely in jars.
They fermented the high-sugar fruit juice into a potent, sour alcoholic drink called Opuntia, and they would dry the peeled fruit in the blistering sun, grind it into a fine, sweet flour, and bake it into small, incredibly durable high-calorie cakes known as queso de tuna. They utilized every single calorie, every fiber, and every chemical property the plant offered.
But perhaps the most surprising, brilliant, and chemically ingenious historical application mentioned in the archives dates back to field reports from 1911 in Central Africa. In the desperate, ongoing fight against malaria, local communities needed a reliable, large-scale way to deal with mosquito larvae breeding rapidly in stagnant standing water.
They discovered that if they heavily crushed the raw cactus pads and spread that incredibly viscous mucilaginous juice evenly over the surface of the ponds, it altered the surface tension of the water, creating a thin, unbreakable biological film over the entire surface.
This tough film physically suffocated the mosquito larvae, preventing them from breaching the surface to breathe. And because the cactus mucilage was so chemically resilient and weather-resistant, this completely natural, highly effective, non-toxic pest control method could persist and protect a pond for up to a full year from just a single heavy application.
Suffocating disease-carrying mosquitoes with modified cactus slime. It is just brilliant applied biology. It just forces you to step back and look at the entire Opuntia genus with a profound, newfound sense of awe.
As we wrap up this deep dive into our massive stack of sources today, we've journeyed from looking at what many consider a dangerous, thorny desert weed to deeply understanding a complex, highly adapted, uncompromising survivor. Whether you are carefully, meticulously planting a 3-foot mound of the spineless Opuntia ellisiana in a sandy, well-draining rock garden with heavy leather gloves, whether you are marveling at the historical hubris and the deceptive, scandalous lore of Luther Burbank's failed agricultural revolution, or whether you are standing at your stove carefully scraping the thorns off a raw nopal pad and watching the baba evaporate to make the perfect tart pork stew, the prickly pear commands absolute respect.
And that respect comes entirely from understanding the why behind the biology. As we always say, knowledge is most valuable when we truly understand why things function the way they do in the natural world. We understand why a plant expends massive energy to develop thousands of microscopic, detectable Glochids to fiercely protect its precious water reserves in a brutal, unforgiving environment.
We understand why bioengineering a wild cactus to be perfectly smooth and spineless, simply to make it easy for human industrial agriculture, fundamentally makes the plant structurally weak, susceptible to cold, and utterly reliant on heavy, unsustainable irrigation.
And we understand that when we choose to intelligently work with nature's formidable defenses, taking the time to learn the passed-down techniques to harvest and prepare it properly, it yields the sweetest, most vibrant magenta-colored rewards.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering, provocative question for you to ponder on your own after we sign off. We spent the early 20th century, led by minds like Luther Burbank, trying to forcefully strip the cactus of its spines, trying to shave the thorns off to make it perfect for our massive industrial needs, only to realize we had inadvertently made it incredibly weak, fragile, and dependent. As we look at the rapidly advancing future of bioengineered supercrops in our modern era of climate change and dwindling water resources, what does the spectacular failure of Burbank's spineless prickly pear really teach us? Are we still making the exact same philosophical mistakes? Are we still trying to blindly shave the thorns off nature to make it compliant and easy, rather than adapting ourselves, our diets, and our agricultural techniques to thrive alongside its brilliant natural defenses? Something to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you keep exploring, stay curious, and seriously invest in some thick, high-quality leather gloves the next time you go hiking in the desert.